David who could stand up to the Goliath of America, who successfully spat in the Yankee eye. For them, Castro was Cuba, and Cuba was Castro.
James Robbins looking back at the life of Fidel Castro, who has died at the age of 90. Now, our Cuba correspondent Will Grant will joins us now live from Havana. Will, I just wondered what sort of reaction there had been on the streets and among ordinary people.
Well, the announcement came very late at night, and a lot of Cubans really still won't be aware of it and won't find out until they wake in a few hours' time. But those who I did see who had found out, generally the reaction was one of sort of muted acceptance. They knew, of course, that their revolutionary leader, the original leader of the Cuban Revolution, was 90 years old, and that it would essentially be an announcement some stage in the next few years. You know, they've thought that for a while. So there is a sort of a sense of an inevitability here, but at the same time, it did catch people a little off guard, because we only saw photos of Fidel looking reasonably well and everything seemed fine a handful of days ago.
And how, in terms of the rapprochement with the United States, somewhat awkward on both sides to begin with, perhaps, I just wondered, has that materially changed the lives of ordinary Cubans? Are there more tourists? Is there more money coming into the country? Do they feel a bit better about themselves?
There's definitely more tourists. That is a noticeable change since President Obama came to Havana and met Raul Castro, and generally the two sides have worked to re-establish their diplomatic ties. So we can chalk that up as a tangible change in Cubans' lives. Beyond that, there isn't that much, and obviously many sectors of society don't work in the service industries or have nothing to do with tourism. So for a lot of people, they're aware that there have been changes, but they can't say that there are, say, more products on the supermarket shelves, or they can leave the country more easily, or they earn more money every month. So, you know, it's a very mixed picture, and it depends very much in what you work.
And just a final thought. I mean, we're looking at some pictures now of Fidel the Revolutionary, which I presume is how many Cubans would wish to remember him, rather than somebody that some people just felt stayed in power too long.
I think that's right. I think if you look at the way that the Cuban government has sort of beatified Che Guevara or Camilo Cienfuegos, you can expect a similar thing to happen with Fidel Castro. It's hard for us sometimes to remember just how crucial he was to Cubans, just what he did to the country, just how involved he was, from the minutiae of decision making right through to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was sort of everything in Cuban life for a very, very long time, and will leave a gap. But that said, I think a lot of Cubans have sort of felt they've been living in a post-Fidel Castro Cuba for a little while, and this now just simply makes it a reality.
Will, thanks very much for joining us from Havana. Will Grant there. Well, for more perspective on this now, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Richard Gott, who's an author and journalist who's travelled to and written about Cuba on many, many occasions. Richard, good to see you. Let's pick up on the revolutionary. I mean, you see those pictures, and to the left around the world, this was the glamour of the revolution, the people who told the Americans to get lost.
I think we have to remember that for the Cubans, this is Granddad's revolution. I mean, it's a fantastic long time ago. And I mean, the extraordinary thing about the revolutionary process, the war in the Sierra Maestra, it was very, very, very quick. Castro landed in December 1956, and he was victorious 2 years later. In fact, the Latin Americans, many of the Latin American left, thought that this was something they could copy and they could all take to the hills and win in 2 years. But of course, it wasn't as easy as all that.
And because the regime was rotten. I mean, the regime that he replaced, we can get on to the problems that he had later, right. But the Batista regime was absolutely despicable, wasn't it?
It was a sort of mafia regime run by a real old-fashioned Latin American dictator. Batista had been quite progressive in the 1930s, but towards the end of his period in power, he was a real dictator with torture chambers and executions, and he was terrible. And so Fidel was greeted with huge enthusiasm.
And at the start, I mean, the revolution did quite extraordinary things for ordinary people. I mean, in terms of healthcare, one of the interesting facts is if you were, unbelievable perhaps to some people, if you were a child born in Cuba, post-Castro Cuba, you had a better chance of living than actually a child, statistically, in the United States, because perinatal mortality, they attacked that and did a lot of stuff for children. So that was the good bit of the balance sheet.
That's right. And it's quite curious that actually, when Castro took over, most of the doctors in Cuba, who were very middle class, they all left. So he was faced with a sort of real medical emergency, and he put through sort of crash programs of teaching people to be doctors, sending them off to Eastern Europe to do doctoring, and came back, and sort of by the mid-60s he had really got this health problem licked.
Now, just stay with us. 1 second, Richard. I think we can go over to Sarah Rainsford in Moscow now, just for some reaction there. Sarah, if you're with us, perhaps you can give us some sense of how Russians or the Russian establishment are reacting, because their links with Castro went through a fairly bumpy period in the Gorbachev years, didn't they?
Well, certainly Cuba went through an extremely bumpy period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because that basically kicked out the economic prop that had been holding up the revolution for many decades. The Soviet deal essentially providing oil, particularly in return for sugar, to Cuba was vitally important to the economy, as well as all the other economic and military support for the island. So once that was removed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then Cuba was plunged into the special period, as Fidel termed it, and it was an extremely difficult period for many people on the island. Lots of people, even today, remember the hunger and the difficulty of those years. But of course, the system survived. The Castros survived, and many people said, you know, if they got through that, and if the system got through that, then it showed its strength, or certainly it showed something. So yes, the relationship has continued since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it of course has been a totally different relationship between Russia and Cuba since the end of Soviet times. But President Putin has made a statement. He sent his condolences to Raul Castro on the death of his brother Fidel. He's talked about Fidel Castro, as you might expect, as a hugely influential and inspirational leader in Cuba. He's talked about him as a true and loyal friend of Russia, and he said that Fidel Castro embodied the high ideals of a politician, a citizen, and a patriot, a man who was truly convinced of the cause to which he devoted his entire life. So a very warm statement from President Putin to Raul Castro, I think underlining the fact that the relationship between the two countries remains strong, if it's entirely different, of course, to the one that was in place between Cuba and the Soviet Union.
And in terms of that, I mean, there was we were just reflecting here in the studio, there was a sense and a hope from Moscow, at least, that the Cuban Revolution could be replicated all over Latin America and perhaps in other places. You know, Castro's intervention in Angola and other places. But it just didn't happen, did it? It just simply didn't happen.
No, it didn't. But I don't think you can underestimate the influence of Fidel Castro, particularly in the Third World, and his direct intervention in many places. You mentioned Angola. That is still remembered today very strongly in Cuba. And then more recently, Cuba's role, if you like, in a different way, sending medics in particular to many countries, including Venezuela in particular, but also to Brazil and to other places. Part of what Fidel and Raul Castro after him sort of presented as a kind of outreach, a kind of socialist mission. Of course, it was also economically absolutely vital to Cuba in more modern days, because by sending those medics to the world, they were essentially funding the system in Cuba. It was a really important source of, and still is a very important source of money to the Cuban regime. So yes, Cuba and Fidel Castro, vastly important, vastly influential, and of course a key figure in terms of the Cold War. Cuba's role in the Cold War, bringing the Cold War to just 90 miles away from America's shores, of course, is another thing that can't be forgotten or underestimated.
And I'm just going to pick you up on exactly that point, actually, Sarah, which is when people read now in the history books about the Bay of Pigs, but particularly about the Cuban Missile Crisis, sometimes they're not quite clear just how close it appeared the world was to utter destruction.
Well, that's right. It's remembered as 13 days when the world was on the brink of destruction, devastation. I think JFK, John F. Kennedy, talked about nuclear ash. I mean, this was a terrifying time, and one in which Cuba, of course, played that very critical role. When those missiles were detected in Cuba, that was when the whole drama began. I've actually been back over the years to the site where those missiles were placed. There's just a small plaque there today, but it was obviously a critical moment in history. The deal was done behind Fidel's back in the end. The Americans and the Russians came to a deal which ended the crisis, in which Fidel was very much left on the sidelines, something he was very bitter about at the time. But it did show that Cuba had the potential to play a key role even so.
Sarah, thanks very much for joining us from Moscow.